Sergeant András Horváth stared at the plate before him, his mind unable to process the sight. Crispy fried chicken, mountains of creamy potatoes, corn glistening with melted butter. This wasn't the watery soup of a prison camp, it was a feast. He was an enemy soldier on enemy soil, yet he was being fed better than he had in years. He didn't know this meal was more than just food, it was a weapon that would dismantle his entire world. He didn't know the woman who served it was watching him, her heart aching with a pity that would change the course of his captivity. But as he lifted the first piece of chicken, one question burned in his mind. Could a simple act of humanity be more disarming than any army? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The world had shrunk to the dimensions of the cattle car, a suffocating box of darkness and steel rumbling through the heart of an enemy nation. For days, the air had grown thick and foul, a potent cocktail of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the sharp metallic tang of fear. Dim, dusty light struggled through small barred openings high on the walls, illuminating a hellish tableau of grim, exhausted faces. Hungarian prisoners of war, 100 souls pressed together, swayed with the rhythm of the tracks. They were a miserable collection of frightened young conscripts, with peach fuzz still on their cheeks, and hardened veterans whose eyes held the ghosts of the Eastern Front. Among them, Sergeant András Horváth stood as straight as the cramped conditions would allow, a pillar of weary resolve in a sea of despair. At 28, he was a career soldier, and the hardships of war had etched themselves into the lines around his eyes and mouth. His uniform was stiff with grime. His body ached with a profound exhaustion that went bone deep. But his spirit, though battered, refused to break. A final jarring lurch, followed by the screech of tortured metal, signaled their arrival. The train shuddered to a stop. A wave of panic, silent but palpable, rippled through the car. This was it, the end of the line. The men, their minds saturated with a steady diet of Axis propaganda, braced for the horrors they had been promised. They envisioned American monsters, whip-wielding guards herding them into brutal labor camps, salt mines where men were worked to death, or worse. In the suffocating dark, András's hand tightened around the worn, creased photograph he kept in his breast pocket. It was his only anchor to a life that now seemed like a distant dream, a picture of his wife, Anna, her smile gentle, and their young son, Peter, perched on his shoulders. He could almost feel the boy's small hands tangled in his hair. He drew a ragged breath, the foul air burning his lungs, and pitched his voice low, a steady rumble meant to quell the rising fear. Istvan, a younger private who had attached himself to András since their capture, shuffled closer, his face pale in the gloom. "This is it." "Sergeant," he whispered, his voice hoarse and cracking, "they'll work us to death in the mines, just like the Russians did to our boys at Stalingrad." András's heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror, but he kept his voice even. "We are soldiers of Hungary," he said, his words a shield against the encroaching dread. "We will face what comes with honor. Do not show them fear." Inside his own mind, however, the propaganda posters from home played on a loop, monstrous American soldiers with demonic faces and clawed hands preying on the innocent, their teeth sharpened to points. He had scoffed at them then, but here, in the belly of the beast, the crude images felt terrifyingly real. He prepared himself for a new kind of war, a battle of will, a desperate fight to retain his dignity in the face of the inhumanity he was certain was coming. The heavy bolt of the car door scraped open, a sound that made men flinch. The doors were thrown wide, flooding the carriage with a rectangle of blinding, painful sunlight. The prisoners stumbled out, shielding their eyes, their bodies weak from hunger and confinement. They were met not by snarling dogs or guards brandishing whips, but by a scene of bewildering order. American soldiers, their uniforms clean and their movements professional, shouted orders in a clipped, impersonal English that sliced through the dazed silence. There was no malice in their voices, just a cold, detached efficiency. The Hungarians were herded like livestock into a long wooden building. The air inside smelled of disinfectant and something else, something acrid and chemical. "Form a single line! No talking!" A guard bellowed through a translator, his voice loud but strangely devoid of emotion. "You will be processed, assigned quarters, and given the rules of this camp." The processing was a blur of humiliation. They were ordered to strip, their lice-ridden, sweat-stained uniforms piled in a corner to be burned. Naked and shivering, they were pushed through a delousing station, where they were dusted from head to toe with a foul-smelling white powder that clung to their skin and filled their nostrils. It was a dehumanizing assembly line procedure, yet it lacked the sadistic cruelty they had been conditioned to expect. There were no taunts, no blows, no laughter at their expense. Finally, they were issued new clothes, simple denim work shirts and trousers, stiff and new, with the letters PW stamped in black ink on the back. The first crack appeared in the wall of their preconceived notions. This disorienting welcome was more unsettling than open brutality. András, now clad in the uniform of a prisoner, watched the American guards closely. They were tall and well-fed, their faces betraying not bloodlust, but a profound sense of boredom. The disconnect was jarring. These were not the monsters from the posters, they were just men doing a job. Camp Algona, Nebraska, stretched out before them under a vast, unforgiving sky. It was a sprawling, hastily constructed camp of barbed wire fences, imposing watchtowers, and row upon row of identical wooden barracks. The sheer, featureless emptiness of the surrounding plains was as intimidating as any fortress wall. The next morning, the Hungarian prisoners were assembled in the camp's central yard, a dusty, windswept expanse that offered no shelter from the persistent wind. Shivering in their thin new clothes, they stood in ragged formation, their eyes fixed on a raised platform where the camp commandant, a tall, stern-faced officer named Major Davies, stood waiting. He began to speak, his English words filtered through a German-speaking translator, the closest linguistic bridge the Americans could provide. The translator's voice echoed across the yard, carrying an announcement that would shatter their reality completely. "You are prisoners of war," the translator began, his German precise and formal. "You will be treated as such, according to the laws of war. However, idleness is a disease. The United States has a need for labor on its farms. The harvest is coming, and there is a shortage of manpower." A murmur went through the crowd, quickly silenced by a sharp command from the guards. "You will work," the voice continued, echoing the major's firm tone. "You will help bring in the harvest on the local farms. You will be fed, you will be housed, and, in accordance with the Geneva Convention, you will be paid for your labor." The commandant paused, letting the words sink in. "Your pay will be in the form of camp scrip, which you may use to purchase goods at the camp canteen. Your conduct will determine your treatment." A wave of stunned silence washed over the prisoners, so profound it seemed to suck the air from the yard. It was followed by a ripple of incredulous murmurs. Paid? Paid for their work? Work on farms, breathing fresh air, not choking on dust in a mine or a factory? This was not the narrative of brutal slavery they had been sold. It made no sense. András felt a cold knot of suspicion tighten in his gut. This had to be a trick, a new and inventive form of psychological torment designed to break them. He leaned toward Istvan, his lips barely moving. "Be on your guard," he whispered. "This is a lie. They are hiding their true intentions. Do not trust them." The very next morning, András's name was called along with 19 others. They were loaded onto the open back of a U.S. Army truck. There were no chains on their wrists or ankles. 2 armed guards climbed in with them, but they sat at the front of the bed, relaxed, their rifles held loosely across their laps. The truck's engine roared to life, and it rumbled out of the main gate, leaving the oppressive geometry of Camp Algona behind. They drove onto a dirt road that cut through a world of overwhelming green and gold. On either side, vast, endless fields of corn stretched to a horizon that seemed 1,000 miles away, the green stalks swaying gently under a brilliant, cloudless blue sky. They passed small, neat farmhouses, each with a white picket fence and a tidy garden. Children, playing in the yards, stopped their games to stare as the truck passed, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, but not the raw, burning hatred András had expected to see in the eyes of his enemy. The wind whipped at his face, a clean, fresh wind that smelled of earth and sun and growing things. The feeling of movement, of the open sky above him after so long in darkness, was both exhilarating and deeply unsettling. It felt less like a journey to a slave labor assignment and more like a bizarre, surreal excursion into the countryside. András, who had grown up on the great plains of Hungary, the son of a farmer, felt a strange pang of familiarity in the landscape. He knew the smell of turned soil, the look of a healthy crop reaching for the sun. Yet this was alien in its sheer, impossible scale, its look of effortless prosperity. The neatness of it all, the sense of boundless abundance, was like nothing he had ever known. He was a soldier, an enemy, a prisoner, yet here he was, being driven through the heart of his enemy's land, not in chains, but like a common laborer on his way to a day's work. His skepticism remained, a hard shell around his heart, but a sliver of unwilling curiosity, sharp and persistent, began to push through the armor of his cynicism. He was still a prisoner, but for the first time since his capture, he did not know what to expect next. The army truck pulled up at the end of a long, dusty driveway, the cloud of dirt it kicked up settling slowly on the vibrant green leaves of the corn. A guard at the front of the truck bed called out 4 names, his voice flat and bored. András's was the third. He swung his legs over the side and dropped to the ground, his boots landing with a soft thud. He and the 3 other prisoners were left standing in a small, bewildered cluster as the truck rumbled away, leaving them in a profound and unnerving silence, broken only by the rustle of a million corn leaves in the gentle breeze. Before them stood a modest but immaculate white farmhouse, its paint bright against the deep blue of the sky. To its right was a large, weathered red barn, its roofline sagging slightly with age and dignity, and all around them, stretching in every direction, were the endless orderly rows of corn, so tall and dense they seemed to merge with the horizon. The air smelled of rich, dark earth and the sweet green scent of growing things. It was the smell of his childhood, a scent he thought he had lost forever. A man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his trousers. He was alone and, as András noted with a jolt, completely unarmed. This must be the farmer. He was of medium height, perhaps in his late 50s, with a face weathered by a lifetime of sun and wind. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of a man who knew work intimately. He approached them without a word, his expression neither friendly nor hostile. It was a look of neutral appraisal, the look a man gives a tool he's about to use. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze passing over each of them. Communication was reduced to its most basic, universal form, the language of action. The farmer, Arthur Jensen, pointed a thick finger toward the towering stalks of corn that surrounded them. Then, he reached out to the nearest stalk, his movements practiced and efficient. With a quick upward pull, he ripped the tassel, the feathery flower at the very top, from the plant and tossed it to the ground. He looked at them, then pointed down one of the long, seemingly infinite rows, making a sweeping gesture with his arm. The contract was clear, unspoken, but perfectly understood. You will do this, and you will do it until the job is done. For András, the work itself was a strange and unexpected comfort. The motion was repetitive, the sun relentless, but it was honest labor. It was a language he understood. He knew the rhythm of the farm, the ache in the shoulders, the sweat that stings the eyes. He fell into the work, his mind quieting as his body took over. He was no longer Sergeant Horváth, a defeated soldier in a foreign land. He was just a man in a field of corn, pulling tassels under a hot sun. The farmer's direct, no-nonsense attitude was also familiar. It was the way of men who worked the land. There was no room for pretense or cruelty, only the demands of the season. He was being treated not as a subhuman enemy to be reviled, but as a necessary laborer. The respect was not in words of kindness, but in the simplicity and clarity of the interaction. He was a tool, yes, a prisoner being put to use, but in this moment, under the vast Nebraska sky, he felt like a valued one. The hours passed in a blur of green stalks and golden sun. The only sounds were the rhythmic tearing of the tassels, the rustle of the leaves, and the heavy breathing of the 4 men as they moved slowly, methodically, down the long rows. At precisely noon, a distant bell chimed from the direction of the farmhouse. Arthur Jensen, who had been working in a section of the field nearby, straightened up and waved them over. He led them, not with a command, but with a simple nod of his head back toward the house. On the shaded porch, a simple wooden table had been set up, noticeably separate from the family's own dining area near the kitchen door. A woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on an apron. This was Martha Jensen. Her face, lined with a quiet concern, held a deep-seated wariness as she looked at the prisoners. She carried a heavy tray, and the sight of what was on it made the prisoners stop in their tracks. Their eyes widened in disbelief. She set down 4 plates, each piled high with food that seemed to belong to another world, a world of impossible abundance. There were pieces of crispy golden fried chicken, a mountain of creamy mashed potatoes with a pool of melted butter in the center, and a generous helping of fresh corn on the cob, each kernel glistening. Beside each plate, she placed a tall, sweating glass of ice-cold milk. For men who had subsisted for months, even years, on watery soup, a crust of hard bread, and the occasional piece of rotting potato, it was a feast beyond the wildest flights of imagination. They sat down hesitantly, their movements stiff and awkward. They watched each other, then glanced at the farmer and his wife, as if expecting the food to be a mirage, or worse, a cruel joke about to be snatched away. Arthur sat at his own table and began to eat without ceremony. That was their permission. Driven by a deep, gnawing hunger that had become a permanent part of their existence, they began to eat. At first, there was a clumsy attempt at decorum, but the primal need for sustenance quickly took over. They ate with a desperate, ravenous intensity, the clatter of forks against plates the only sound on the porch. They devoured the chicken, stripped the corn cobs clean, and scraped every last trace of potato from their plates. They drank the cold milk in huge, grateful gulps. Martha Jensen stood in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, watching them. Her initial wariness, the fear of having enemy soldiers so close to her home, slowly began to melt away as she watched them eat. She saw not the hardened, monstrous soldiers of the newsreels, but gaunt, hollow-eyed young men, their uniforms hanging off their thin frames. They were just boys, she realized, so terribly far from home. She turned to her husband, her voice low and thick with an emotion she hadn't expected to feel. "They're just boys, Arthur," she murmured, her gaze fixed on András, who was carefully savoring his last bite of chicken as if trying to commit the taste to memory. "Look at them. So far from home." This was the moment the foundations of András's world began to crumble. The act of sharing a meal, and such a generous, impossible meal, was a gesture of radical humanity that transcended the boundaries of war and enmity. It was a direct, irrefutable contradiction to every piece of propaganda, every speech, every ingrained belief that had defined his enemy. He felt a confusing, overwhelming mix of emotions, gratitude so profound it felt like pain, shame at his own ravenous hunger, and a dizzying sense of disbelief. He was an enemy soldier, a man who had fought and killed for a cause that stood in direct opposition to everything these people represented. Yet, here he was, sitting on their porch, being fed with a generosity he had not known even in his own army. The fried chicken was not just food, it was a message. The cold milk was not just a drink, it was an act of grace. And in that moment, Sergeant András Horváth began to question everything he thought he knew. The afternoon sun was a merciless weight, the heat rising in shimmering waves from the dark soil. The air was thick and still, making every breath feel like a conscious effort. A younger, weaker prisoner named János, who had been quiet and withdrawn all day, suddenly faltered. He stumbled, his face ashen, and then collapsed in a heap between the corn rows. András and the other 2 prisoners rushed to his side, calling his name. At the edge of the field, the American guard, who had been sitting in the shade of the army truck, saw the commotion and started to approach, his rifle held at the ready. But before the guard could cover half the distance, Arthur Jensen was already there. He had been working in a nearby section and had seen the boy go down. Without a moment's hesitation, he knelt beside the fallen prisoner. He uncorked his own canteen, a dented metal flask that had clearly seen years of use, and gently lifted János's head, pouring a small stream of cool water onto his cracked lips. The boy coughed and sputtered, his eyes fluttering open. Arthur then looked at the other prisoners, then at the approaching guard. He hooked his strong arms under János's shoulders and, with a grunt of effort, helped the semi-conscious boy to his feet and guided him toward the shade of the supply truck parked at the edge of the field. He eased him down to sit against a wheel. Arthur looked at the guard, who had now arrived, his face a mask of professional neutrality. The farmer pointed at János, then pointed to the shade of the truck, and then made a simple, decisive gesture with his hand, a flat palm indicating that the boy would stay put. "He rests," Arthur said, his voice firm and clear. He then pointed to his canteen. "Water, understand?" There was no anger in his voice, no frustration at the loss of a worker, no thought of punishment or docking the boy's pay. There was only a simple, practical compassion for a fellow human being suffering in the heat. The guard, a young man from a city who likely knew nothing of farm work, simply took in the situation, saw the farmer's resolute expression, and nodded in agreement. He understood. András watched the entire exchange from a few feet away, his heart pounding. He had expected, at best, a cold indifference from the farmer. At worst, he had expected anger. Perhaps a blow or a kick to get the lazy prisoner back on his feet. Cruelty was the currency of war, the expected norm in the relationship between captor and captive. But this was something else entirely. This was a spontaneous act of kindness, a moment of concern that placed a man's well-being above the demands of the work. The farmer's immediate, unthinking compassion for his enemy prisoner was a powerful testament to a moral code that András was only just beginning to comprehend. It was a code that was not written in any military manual or international convention, but was etched into the man's character. As he watched Arthur hand his own canteen to János, András felt another piece of his indoctrinated worldview fall away. He was beginning to question the very foundations of his beliefs about the war, about the nature of the enemy, and about his own role in the vast, brutal machinery of the conflict. A sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in late that afternoon, the sky turning from a brilliant blue to a bruised, angry purple in a matter of minutes. The first fat drops of rain sent them scrambling for shelter, and Arthur gestured for them to follow him into the cavernous, sweet-smelling interior of the barn. The rain came down in a torrent, drumming a deafening rhythm on the tin roof. Inside, the air was cool and filled with the scent of hay, old wood, and livestock. They stood in an awkward, silent group, the 4 prisoners and the farmer, separated by a gulf of language and war. Just as the silence was becoming unbearable, a new figure appeared in the wide barn doorway. It was the farmer's daughter, Sarah, a girl of about 16 with her father's serious eyes and a bright, insatiable curiosity. She had been watching them from the house. Shyly, she approached the group, clutching a book to her chest. She stopped in front of András, who seemed the most approachable of the grim-faced men. She held out the book. It was a children's picture book, its cover showing a cartoon drawing of a smiling cow. Sarah, who was studying German in school, saw an opportunity to practice and, perhaps, to bridge the unnerving silence. She opened the book to a page with a picture of a horse. Pointing to the image, she spoke a single tentative word. Feared. András, whose own German was functional from his time on the front, was taken aback. He looked from the girl's earnest face to the picture and back again. A slow, careful bridge of communication was being built, plank by fragile plank. He nodded, and a small, sad smile touched his lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "Lo," he replied, giving the Hungarian word. Sarah's face lit up. She turned the page. "Hund," she asked, pointing to a picture of a dog. "Kutya," András said, his voice a little stronger now. They continued like this for several minutes, the girl saying the German word, the soldier replying in Hungarian. Cow, pig, chicken, sheep. It was a simple, almost childish game, but in the echoing space of the barn, with the storm raging outside, it felt like a profound act of peace. Emboldened by the connection, András felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to share something of his own. He reached into the breast pocket of his denim shirt and carefully pulled out the worn, creased photograph of his wife and son. The paper was soft and fragile from countless hours of being held in his hand. He held it out for the girl to see. His voice was thick with emotion, the words catching in his throat. "Meine Frau," he said, pointing to Anna's smiling face. "Mein Sohn." He pointed to the small boy on his shoulders. Then, forgetting the language barrier, he added softly in his own tongue the words of prayer on his lips. "Anna, Asa kiss Peter. Anna and my little Peter." Sarah looked at the photograph, her young face full of a solemn understanding that went beyond her years. She looked at the woman's kind eyes and the little boy's laughing face. Then she looked up at the tall, weary soldier, and for the first time, she did not see an enemy. She saw a father. For András, it was a moment of startling, painful clarity. In Sarah's curious, innocent eyes, he saw a reflection of his own child, a world away. The abstract concept of the enemy, a faceless, monstrous entity he had been trained to hate and kill, was dissolving before his very eyes. It was being replaced by the concrete, undeniable reality of the Jensen family, a farmer who valued a man's well-being, a mother who saw boys instead of soldiers, and a daughter who wanted to learn the word for horse in a strange new language. The war was still raging, but here in this barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and the sound of rain, the battle inside András's soul was quietly, irrevocably coming to an end. At the end of the first week, back within the rigid geometry of Camp Algona, the prisoners were lined up to receive their first payment. An officer sat at a wooden table, a metal box open before him, and as each man who had worked on the farm stepped forward, he was handed a small stack of paper coupons. András held the scrip in his palm, staring at it. It was flimsy, printed in simple black ink on colored paper, but it felt heavier than gold. It was a tangible acknowledgement, a physical representation of a week of sweat and aching muscles under the Nebraska sun. It was not a handout. It was wages. That evening, the camp canteen, a long, bare-bones room with shelves of simple goods, was transformed. A low, excited buzz filled the air, a sound of life that had been absent for years. Men who had possessed nothing, who had been reduced to the clothes on their backs and the memories in their heads, were now consumers. They clutched their scrip with a fierce pride, their eyes scanning the shelves with a hungry intensity. Istvan, his face alight with a boyish glee András hadn't seen since before their capture, held up a pack of American cigarettes, laughing in sheer disbelief. "They are paying us to be their prisoners, Sergeant," he exclaimed, shaking his head as he carefully tore open the pack. "Can you believe it? They are paying us to be here." András watched him, a slow smile touching his own lips. He bought a bar of chocolate, its wrapper a bright glossy red and silver, a piece of impossible luxury. He also bought a single plain postcard and a pencil. He walked back toward the barracks, leaving Istvan to enjoy his smoke. He found a quiet corner, sat on the edge of his cot, and looked at the postcard in his hand. "No, Istvan," he said softly to himself, the words meant only for his own ears. "They are not paying us to be prisoners. They are paying us for our work. There is a difference." The distinction was everything. It was the difference between being a slave and being a worker, between being an object and being a man. The simple act of being able to purchase something, to make a choice, no matter how small, was a powerful balm. It restored a measure of the dignity he thought he had lost forever in the mud and blood of the front, in the suffocating darkness of the cattle car. He was still a prisoner, a man without freedom, but he was no longer just a number. He was a laborer who had earned his keep. Later that night, by the dim, unsteady light of a single bare bulb that cast long, dancing shadows across the crowded barracks, András sat on his cot. The postcard lay on his knee, a small, blank rectangle of possibility and pain. The raucous noise of the barracks, the laughter, the arguments, the snores, faded into a dull roar as he tried to find the words. How could he possibly explain his new reality to Anna? How could he describe the vast, fertile land, the impossible generosity of a plate of fried chicken, the quiet dignity of a day's wage, without sounding like a traitor or a madman? He knew his letter would be read by a censor, an unseen American eye looking for codes, for propaganda, for any hint of military intelligence. Every word had to be chosen with the precision of a surgeon. To complain would be to lie, but to tell the unvarnished truth would be a cruelty to his wife, who was likely enduring hardships he could barely imagine in a war-torn Hungary, a country now falling under the shadow of a new, Soviet-sponsored oppression. He pressed the pencil to the card, the lead scratching against the stiff paper. He wrote about the land first, a safe topic. He described the endless fields of corn, telling her it reminded him of the plains back home, but so much bigger. So vast it seemed to swallow the sky. He wrote about the work, how it was hard and honest, how the sun felt hot on his back, a feeling she would understand. He assured her he was healthy, that he was being treated correctly according to the rules of war. He paused, his pencil hovering over the card. He wanted to tell her about the Jensens, about Arthur's quiet respect, Martha's pity, Sarah's innocent curiosity. He wanted to tell her that his hatred, the burning fuel that had sustained him for so long, had been extinguished, not by force, but by simple kindness. But he couldn't. It was too complex, too dangerous. Instead, he dared to add a single coded sentence, a message of hope disguised as a simple observation. "The farmer has a daughter with eyes as bright as our Peter's," he wrote, his hand trembling slightly. "They are good people here." He stared at the words, praying she would understand their true meaning, that she would read between the lines and know that he was not surrounded by monsters but by human beings. He felt a profound, aching sense of isolation, a man caught between two irreconcilable worlds. His hatred for the enemy had completely evaporated, replaced by a complex, tangled web of confusion, gratitude, and a deep, overwhelming longing for his own farm, his own family, his own life. He signed his name, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. Weeks turned into a month, and the work continued. The initial shock wore off, replaced by a steady, predictable routine. The prisoners became a familiar sight in the fields, their blue denim shirts moving like slow, methodical ships through the sea of green corn. As a gesture of goodwill and as a test of the evolving program, Major Davies decided to allow a small, trusted group of prisoners to attend the annual harvest festival in the nearby town of Kearney. András, whose quiet diligence had been noted by the guards, was among the chosen few. They rode into town in the back of the army truck, this time feeling less like prisoners and more like guests on a strange outing. The town was a vibrant tapestry of Americana. Bunting was strung between lampposts, and the main street was closed to traffic, filled instead with long tables laden with pies, preserves, and produce. The air smelled of popcorn, grilled meat, and sweet apple cider. Families laughed, children chased each other with shrieks of delight, and a brass band played lively, unfamiliar music from a gazebo in the town square. The prisoners, walking in a tight group with two guards, were an anomaly. The townspeople watched them, their faces a mixture of emotions. There was curiosity, of course, and a lingering suspicion, but there was also a surprising amount of simple pity. They were not met with glares of hatred, but with quiet, appraising looks. They saw a slice of American life they never could have imagined, a world away from the grand imperialistic pronouncements of their own government's propaganda. This was not a nation of decadent, warmongering monsters. It was a community of hard-working, church-going people, their faces open and their laughter easy. It was, András realized with a jolt, deeply, profoundly similar to his own village back home on festival day. A man in a clerical collar, his face gentle and kind, approached their small procession. He was holding several paper plates, each bearing a large, fragrant slice of apple pie, its crust golden and flaky. He nodded toward the prisoners and offered the plates to the lead guard. "Every man who helps bring in the harvest deserves a share of the bounty," the pastor said, his voice warm and his smile genuine. "It's only right. God bless these boys." The guard, surprised but seeing no harm, accepted the plates and passed them to the prisoners. András took one, the plate warm in his hands. The monstrous propaganda image he had carried in his head for so long did not just crack, it completely and irrevocably shattered. He understood with a sudden piercing clarity that the war was a conflict of governments, of ideologies, of distant men drawing lines on maps. It was not a conflict of people. The people, here and at home, were the same. They worked the land, they loved their children, they celebrated the harvest, and they found grace in sharing its bounty. The apple pie, sweet and warm and spiced with cinnamon, was like a sacrament of this new understanding, a communion that washed away the last vestiges of his ingrained hatred. The air grew cooler, the brilliant blue of the summer sky softening to a paler shade. The first hints of autumn began to touch the edges of the leaves, and the relentless work of detasseling was finally done. On their final day at the Jensen farm, the 4 prisoners worked to clear the last few rows, their movements synchronized by weeks of shared labor. As they prepared to board the army truck for the last time, a profound and bittersweet silence settled over them. This place, which they had arrived at with such fear and suspicion, had become a strange and unexpected sanctuary. Arthur Jensen walked over from the barn, wiping his hands on his trousers. He stopped before them, his weathered face serious. He looked each man in the eye, a long, appraising look that held no judgment. Then he extended his calloused hand. He offered it first to the oldest prisoner, a man in his 40s, then to the next, and finally to András. András took the farmer's hand. The grip was firm, dry, and strong. It was not the handshake of a master to a slave, or a victor to the vanquished. It was the handshake of one working man to another, a gesture of mutual respect that transcended language in the uniforms they wore. Just then, Martha came out of the house. She carried a small paper bag for each of them. Inside were freshly baked oatmeal cookies, still slightly warm. She pressed a bag into each man's hand, her smile shy but full of a genuine warmth that reached her eyes. "For the ride back," she said simply. On the porch, Sarah stood watching. She didn't speak, but as the prisoners climbed into the back of the truck, she gave a small, shy wave, a silent acknowledgement of the strange, fragile connection they had formed over picture books and shared words. Arthur Jensen gave a final curt nod, his own form of farewell. "Good work," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Thank you." The 2 simple words held more meaning for András than any speech or commendation. They were an affirmation of his value, his effort, his humanity. As the truck pulled away, kicking up the familiar cloud of dust, András looked back at the white farmhouse and the red barn until they were just small shapes against the horizon. He was not the same man who had arrived in a cattle car months ago, braced for brutality and death. He had been shown a different path, a different way of seeing the world and the people in it. He was still a prisoner of war, but something inside him had been set free. That night, András lay on his bunk in the noisy barracks, the taste of Martha's oatmeal cookies still a sweet ghost in his memory. The camp was the same. The future was still a vast, terrifying unknown. He didn't know when or if he would ever see his home again. He didn't know if Anna and Peter were safe, or if they even knew he was alive. The war was far from over. But as he pulled the worn photograph from his pocket and looked at the smiling faces of his wife and son under the dim light, he knew he had a new story to tell. One day, if God was willing, he would sit with his son and tell him about the war. But it would not be a story of glorious battles won or hated enemies vanquished. It would be a story of unexpected kindness in the heart of enemy territory. It would be a story of a farmer's handshake, a woman's generosity, and a young girl's smile. It would be a story about how the most profound victories are not won with guns and bombs, but with the quiet, powerful force of human decency. The War of Nations raged on, but for Sergeant András Horváth, the battle of ideologies had been won. He was a prisoner of war, but his mind and his heart were finally, irrevocably, free. He carried with him the memory of the Nebraska cornfields, a symbol not of his captivity, but of an unexpected and life-changing harvest of humanity.